Yakuza Kiwami, a game released in 2016 on the PS3 and PS4 in Japan, and then later came to just PS4 in 2017 everywhere else. It was also later released for the PC in 2019, and then a little over a year later came to Xbox in 2020. It was a remake of the very first Yakuza game, simply called Yakuza, although it wasn't necessarily just a simple remake, which I will get into later. It was released right after Yakuza 0, and in Japan was released before Yakuza 6 in the same year. In terms of gameplay, this remake of the first game is, actually more of a Yakuza 0 expansion, more than one remake. You could essentially view it as Yakuza 0.5, only without playable Majima, and you can't go to Sotobori. The only gameplay things that are carried over from the original game are some sub-stories, as well as the overall progression of the game's story, and also having XP and a level up system that functions the same as 0, but the abilities are sorted similarly to the original. With the story progression, I mean that the main objectives as well as the main bosses and long battles are all the same, but then all of the sub-stories that weren't in the original, as well as a unique gameplay element, are all original to Kiwami and aren't in 0 or the original. The unique gameplay element is easily the biggest thing from Kiwami and also the biggest meme. It was simply called Majima Everywhere, where Goro Majima is literally everywhere in the game, just so that he can fight you. Before I get into that, however, I'll say that I do exaggerate a little bit when I say it's the exact same as Yakuza 0. For one, a lot of balance changes have been made between the abilities. Another thing is the removal of the stupid gear mechanic, as now the way the heat functions is exactly like all of the other games. The Dragon of Dojima style, or the Legend style as it was known in 0, now has a different upgrade tree. Rather than you just having all of the abilities right away, with the upgrade tree just being stat upgrades, you instead have to learn all the abilities by doing Majima Everywhere stuff, although some abilities are locked behind doing training with Komaki. All of these encounters with the Majima Everywhere system are just like side quests, as there's only 3 times that this system plays into the main story, but Majima shows up in many different ways, whether he's hiding in a sewer or just walking around on the street, and he'll fight you either because you encountered him on the street, or you did something specific like go to a bar where he's just conveniently there. It's fun at first being able to have a tough opponent you can keep on fighting, but after a while you end up hunting him down as you try to unlock more abilities for the dragon style. He also has 4 fighting styles, which are his ones from 0, so he'll spice it up every now and then, but it does get a bit tedious when you're interrupted by him constantly for the fight to then potentially go for a bit because he has a lot of health. However, I will say that if it wasn't for the Majima Everywhere system, Kiwami probably would have been like an 8-hour game. Not that that would have been a bad thing, but just that the Yakuza games are typically a lot longer. This is partially because Yakuza 1 wasn't very long, but considering now that you move a lot faster, you can clear out enemies a lot faster, and you have more options for skipping more dialogue and cutscenes, the game is a lot faster than the original. So that's why they thought to expand on the length a bit by adding Majima Everywhere. Now then, Kiwami's balancing between the styles is a lot better than 0, and unlike 0, it adds a few extra abilities that allow you to instantly swap fighting styles, such as being able to swap mid-evade without slowing down the game. However, after you do a bunch of Majima Everywhere stuff and gain a bunch of abilities, you may come to realize that the dragon style is the best one, making the others kinda pointless. But there are still times where you do need one of the styles. For example, each style has an ability where you can drain all of your heat and grant yourself a specific buff for a period of time. Brawler's ability makes it so that you don't flinch attacks like you normally might. Rush's ability makes it so that your combo speed is super fast. Beast's ability increases your attack power by quite a bit, and Dragon's is worthless and dumb and stupid, and that's because all it does is make it so that your heat won't drop while it's active, but you have to consume all of your heat to do it, so like what heat is there to lose? Then there's another thing where bosses will stop to regenerate their health, which as long as you have the correct ability, you can stop by swapping to the fighting style that matches their heat aura and doing a specific heat action, thereby smacking the shit out of them and stopping their health from going up. But besides all of that, once you get all the upgrades, you can just kinda chill and dragon forever and not suffer any sort of consequences at all, to be honest. Now then, the story, and as you could probably guess by the fact that it's a remake, it's the exact same story as Yakuza 1's. This of course means that it automatically sucks. The animations in the cutscenes are copied from the original, and it has the exact same script as the original too. The only difference between Kiwami's story and the originals is that all of the dialogue in the cutscenes was re-recorded, some of the actors were recasted, and there were some additional scenes added. These scenes were an entire prologue, an expansion on a cutscene that explains the existence of the Majima Everywhere system, and several cutscenes set during Kiryu's time in prison at the start of the game that shows what's going on with Nishiki. These additional scenes do a great job in showing the player Nishiki's descent into madness that happens entirely off-screen in the original, and in the original you really know next to nothing about Nishiki besides that he's Kiryu's friend, and he apparently has a sister, but thanks to these scenes, and an even bigger thanks to Yakuza 0, we know a lot more about Nishiki, and so it adds a lot to the story of the original. Speaking of Yakuza 0, if it wasn't obvious from the gameplay, the game very clearly assumes, or at least hopes, that you've played Yakuza 0, and this game very obviously exists to be played right after Yakuza 0. Once again, it really is just like a big story expansion on 0, not to say that Kiwami can't be enjoyed without playing it, but without it, you'll just not have as good of an experience as someone else. However, if you've never played 0 but did play the original, your experience on the story will probably improve improve. But speaking of the original, as Kiwami copies animations and all that sort of stuff, a common criticism of the cutscenes arose. Besides the fact that they were animated like shit to begin with, so of course they still look like shit, the facial animations were messed up in Kiwami. I think the reason for this was that because of the updated character models and voice acting, a lot of, if not all of the facial animations ended up being redone to a degree, or at least the mouth movements definitely did. Then because it was face stuff, I think there were some areas where they just kind of didn't animate eyebrows or simply tried to recreate how it looked in the original because they were unable to copy it from the first game. Basically what I'm saying is they didn't spend too long making this game, so with a lot of the cutscenes they just kind of did the bare minimum and went home. Although within some of the brand new cutscenes, you can actually see that the facial animations are just as good as Zero's, so it clearly wasn't just a general problem across the entire game, but only cutscenes that were copied from the original. But story aside, the soundtrack of this game features a number of remixes of songs from the first game's soundtrack, including a surprisingly large handful of brand new original songs. There's no real fun facts that I have for the soundtrack itself, but I can say that Hidenori Shoji, the guy who did all but 4 of the songs from the original game, still worked on Kiwami 1's soundtrack. He's still one of the franchise's key composers, but since the first game, he's been joined by a collection of based individuals such as Yuri Fukuda, Sara Yoshida, Chihiro Aoki, Zenta, Hyde Lunch, and 83 Key. These 7 people are the people who are mostly responsible for all the soundtracks of the more recent Yakuza games, with all 7 of these people working on games like Yakuza Like a Dragon and Lost Judgment, as well as probably Gaiden and Infinite Wealth. Another one of the names from the original game's soundtrack was a guy called Keitaro Hanada. He's credited on the soundtrack for Kiwami, but only because he composed a song called The End of the Drama, which was rearranged by Hidenori Shoji in Yakuza Kiwami as The End of the Dogma. But the reason I wanted to bring this up is because Keitaro Hanada composed 2 songs for the first game, then proceeded to not compose anything for any of the other games up until the original Ishin, where he composed a number of absolutely phenomenal songs such as the best version of Nishiki's theme, Don't At Me. Then after Ishin, he once again dipped from the franchise. However, he's made a triumphant return with Lost Judgment, where he composed 2 songs, being the chase theme and the standard boss theme, and I pray to whatever god can hear me that he sticks around for future games because he is awesome. I also really wish that one of my favorite songs from the game wasn't from a mini game where a bunch of women dressed up as bugs, in quotation marks, wrestled each other, because then I sound weird for liking the music. Now then, all of that aside, Kiwami was a game that didn't really need to exist. If it was a story DLC for Yakuza 0 where you just played as Kiryu skipping through the main events of Yakuza 1, it honestly would have been the same experience. I still had fun with it, but back when I bought it, I only paid $27 for it, and if I had have spent more, I would have been a bit miffed. However, when I was looking through my Steam purchase history to see how much I spent on Yakuza Kiwami, I realized that I had bought Yakuza 0 for $8.50 Australian, and that is literally the best $8.50 purchase I've ever made in my entire life. While the game did make a handful of minor gameplay improvements, it stands out in a sort of bad way compared to the other mainline games that were identical to whatever games came before them. These copy sequels basically were Yakuza 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 6 to Kiwami 2, and then Judgment to Lost Judgment. What I mean by this is that going from Yakuza 1 to 2, you had a bunch of little gameplay improvements as well as new content like a new region and some new minigames. Then going from Yakuza 3 to 4, you had 3 brand new playable characters that massively changed up the gameplay. Then with Yakuza 6 to Kiwami 2, there are a decent amount of combat improvements that Kiwami 2 made, but it also added quite a large amount of side content compared to what 6 had. Then most recently, going from Judgment to Lost Judgment massively expanded on everything in Judgment. But then with 0 to Kiwami 1, you get half the playable characters, half the explorable areas, half the fighting styles, less side content, and even if you do like the story of the first game, it has a far worse story with very janky looking cutscenes. Again, while I played and enjoyed Kiwami, it's a game that probably didn't really need to exist. Not to say that you should go play the original PS2 version instead, because not to be controversial or anything, but you don't have to play every game in the series, play one game and then go do something else, touch another game franchise. For God's sake, Yakuza fans, there are like a million video games that exist. But anyway, if Kiwami never happened, the game that came out immediately after 0 would have been 6. And if you go directly from Yakuza 0 to Yakuza 6, the game had things in it to catch you up in the stories of the other games, but the story of Yakuza 6 doesn't really rely on plot points from the first game or anything like that besides stuff like how Kiryu met Haruka. However, Yakuza 6 was the first Dragon Engine game, which became a massively revolutionary leap for the series that it hadn't had for almost a decade. So rather than the game that followed Yakuza 0 just being Yakuza 0 but worse, it would have instead been something that was a massive revolution for the games as a whole. But if the first Dragon Engine game was not Yakuza 6, and was instead a remake of the first game with some touched up story elements such as a few additional cutscenes, I think that it would have been a lot better. I'll get into it with the Yakuza 6 video, but Yakuza 6 had a lot of issues with it that were most likely a cause of it being their first game with their brand new engine, and their desire to do things that would have taken ages, like making it so that every single cutscene in the game, even ones in sub-stories, were all fully voiced, for example. But rather than making those mistakes with something brand new, it may have ultimately been a better idea to test the waters with something already established, so that way when they actually would have released Yakuza 6, it probably wouldn't have had a lot of the issues that it had. Like I said before, Kiwami 2 made a lot of gameplay improvements over Yakuza 6 and increased the overall density of side content, but in my opinion, it would have been a lot better if a mainline entry was the game that made a lot of improvements over a remake rather than the other way around. If you want a recent example as well of them testing the waters, if Like a Dragon 9 or something ends up being an Unreal Engine game, you can see that they tested the waters with Like a Dragon Ishin. Now imagine if they did that with Yakuza Kiwami with the Dragon Engine. All of the issues present within Ishin probably won't show up in whatever game comes out next in the Unreal Engine, but all in all, there's no harm done by playing Kiwami. If you could only play one or a few of the Yakuza games, this would be very low down on the list. If you play it right after Zero, like Sega definitely wanted you to do, there's a high chance you'll be disappointed. But in all honesty, a very big reason for that isn't because Kiwami 1 was bad by any stretch of the imagination. Even the shittiest Yakuza game is still a lot better than a lot of games, but RGG Studio kinda shot themselves in the foot by making Yakuza 0 so good, although it did give us, like I said earlier, a million Majima memes, so can you really be mad at it? Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, tiger drop the like button like I'm about to tiger drop Thug Majima. Oh, I hope you look forward to the next video in the series, which will be on the first Dragon Engine game, which was also the third and so far final revolution the series has had. That game, of course, being Yakuza 6.